All right. So now that we have Drew, we're prepared. So like I said yesterday, we looked at the reasons why industrialization is able to become successful and the ways that industrialization was becoming just ginormous in the United States in this era, making the United States a leading industrial power. Today we're going to look at the other side of that. And we know that for workers, for factory laborers, for people that are in the factories doing the work, that has long been, this is not a new concept of those people feeling exploited, being exploited, and really struggling to earn enough of a wage to make a decent living. That's not a new concept. Remember, we talked about this last year, really, with the beginnings of industrialization, and we talked about the beginnings of a labor movement and the beginnings of labor unions. Now, labor unions, let me go back just a second, just to remind ourselves, so early on, workers, of course, experiencing all sorts of problems and struggles. What were some of those specific problems and struggles that workers were dealing with? Yes?
Poor working conditions.
Poor working conditions. Factories were unsafe, they were unsanitary, they were poorly ventilated, machinery could be dangerous, all of those working conditions could be quite ugly. What else? Like very, very low pay, a very minimal wage. Again, that was one of the reasons we talked about why industrialization takes off in those periods, because you have a cheap labor source, because the wages were very low. Yes?
Systems like company script.
I'm sorry, what?
Company script. Big company towns.
Oh, okay. So you have, yes, in some cases, and some people looked at that as a real, the company town was real idealistic, and early it might have been, but also exploitive and abusive practices in that sense, higher rent. And we're going to talk about a strike situation today that involved company town and some of the discriminatory, but exploitive practices and unfair practices there. We talked about, in these days, if you got hurt on the job or sick or something and couldn't work anymore, what happened to you? You just couldn't work anymore. Child labor, we know, is a big issue, where children as young as, maybe even 8 or 9 were employed in factories instead of being able to go to school and things like that. So long hours, incredibly low pay, and very, very powerless to do much about it, because we also know that industrialization means more and more unskilled labor. And so labor that could easily be replaced, and especially with the massive wave of immigration, which we're going to talk about next, taking place, that meant that more and more potential laborers coming to the United States every day that could, be hired in place. So workers really had no leverage to bargain for change or to seek something better. So because if they go and complain to the boss and say, I want more money, or I want you to fix this, they probably just get fired, and that the boss man could hire somebody else. So we know those have already been problems. So we're going to right now look at a few more specific things, as we're just labeling all of this, lumping it all together under this category of industrial warfare, meaning these are going to be some tactics, sometimes tactics, but also just different obstacles in the way of labor, things that were preventing workers from being successful, and things that were making labor unions or preventing labor unions from being successful. Because we know early on, laborers had attempted.
At this time, you may resume instruction. Remember, if we are ever in a real lockdown situation, you will only be released from the lockdown when your door is unlocked by an administrator or by a law enforcement officer. Again, the drill is complete.
We're advanced, so we finished first. Okay, so these are things that, so labor unions, workers trying to band together, to operate as a unit, to say, as one person, I can't have sway over the boss, but if we all work together and we all say we're not going to work until this happens, or we want this wage increase or something, maybe we can be more successful. But there's multiple tactics, and there's just multiple things working against labor unions in this period that are preventing them from being successful. And we're going to see a lot of these things, several of these things play out in some of the labor disputes we're going to talk about today. One of the things that was preventing labor unions from being successful was that oftentimes force or violence is used against them. We're going to see this happen more than once today. So one of the tactics, obviously, that labor unions would sometimes use, of course, was going on strike. And what does that mean if unions or workers go on strike? They stop working. They say, we're not going to work until we get more money, or we're not going to work until you provide us better facilities or a school or something like that. Those strikes are hardly ever effective. They never really had been and continue not to be. Some of the reason because they're easily replaceable, but also because sometimes, as we're going to see today, employers would use force against them. They would employ private security to come in and bust up the strike, and many of these strikes become quite violent. We'll even see in some cases military called in, either state militia in some cases called in to stop a strike or to quell some violence that was taking place. And so there is this use of force against labor unions, and so they end up, a lot of these demonstrations end up becoming extremely violent, making them ineffective, but that also has an effect on public opinion, what I'll get to in a moment as well. Other specific strategies that employers were using to prevent labor unions from being successful and using to quite successfully actually break the power of labor unions was a tactic called lockouts, which is exactly what it sounds like, is when they would literally lock the union out and lock up the factory and not allow the workers back in. So it's kind of like almost like the opposite of a strike. Instead of the workers saying, we're not going to come in and work until you do A, B, and C, it is the employer locking the workers out of the factory, and saying, you're not coming in here to work if you're going to try to unionize, or if you're going to engage in demonstrations, or until you accept my terms, until you accept the wage that I say, or the conditions that I say, you're locked out and you're not going to work. So it's kind of the opposite strategy of a strike, but literally locking the place up and keeping the union workers, or the ones that they thought were kind of the troublemakers, out. The employers will also make use of a strategy or an agreement called yellow dog contracts. Yellow dog contracts were contracts, obviously agreements, that they would sometimes force workers to sign if they wanted the job, if they wanted to be employed. In a yellow dog contract, basically the worker was promising not to join a union, that they would not unionize, they would not be a part of union activity, and they would not engage in any labor organization. So making that a stipulation of their employment. They have to sign this yellow dog contract that says they're not going to join a union to prevent them from doing so. You can see that this flyer right here mentions the yellow dog contract, urging the employees, don't sign that. That's meant to break the power of unions, and we're not going to try to let them do that to us. Another tactics that they would use, something called blacklisting. And blacklisting is a general word, doesn't specifically relate to the labor movement. Blacklisting is kind of a figurative thing. Blacklisting means kind of that the employers would, those people that were involved in unions, particularly if they were the real, seen as kind of a rowdy type, the ones that seem to be stirring up trouble, the labor organizers, for whatever reason, employers would blacklist them, which means kind of literally, or figuratively rather, putting them on this list to say, these are the troublemakers, these are the people that are organizing workers, these are the people that are causing demonstrations and violence and stuff, don't hire them. So it's like a don't hire list. Literally, is it an actual list that employers float around? Maybe, maybe not, but you see the idea. It's sort of labeling certain people, whether they were just involved in the union, or particularly if they had been involved in leading demonstrations or encouraging strikes or something like that, they would get blacklisted, and that would make it very, very difficult for them to get a job and to be employed, and it would just sort of destroy their reputation. So again, blacklisting is a general word. You could use that in any kind of circumstance, that whole idea of circulating people's names around saying don't hire them. Yeah. Yes, that's blacklisting. In the 1950s, they would ones that they suspected or were labeling as communist, and a lot of them never worked again. Yeah, that's blacklisting. Exact same thing. Okay. Now, so some of these are tactics that the employers are using to break the power of unions, like the lockout, making them sign yellow dog contracts, and also blacklisting people. They are also utilizing the government. Oftentimes tends to come down most of the time on the side of employers. And so one thing that is oftentimes used to break strikes and to break up union activity is court orders, or the more precise word for that, more technical word for that, injunctions. You'll see examples, we'll see one today, where strikes, and this has been used before, strikes are stopped because the court orders them to. Supreme Court of a state or wherever, federal courts will declare that those strikes are illegal for one reason or another, that they are not lawful, and therefore forcing the strikers to stop, or forcing labor organizations to stop. And again, that had been a problem, early in the 19th century, as oftentimes courts were declaring either strikes to be illegal, or even just labor unions themselves to be illegal, and to be conspiracies of some sort. So a lot of times what unions are fighting for, we have to realize, in addition to better wages and better conditions and those sorts of things, sometimes what they're also fighting for is simply the right to exist and the right to freely associate with the union, and to not be punished or blacklisted or whatever for simply being a part of that. So having, being recognized as a legitimate institution and a legitimate organization that employers are required to negotiate with and bargain with, that's something they're fighting for as well. Another thing that really works against labor unions in this period, and why they're really going to struggle to have success, is that public opinion is largely against them as well. The general consensus of the American public is, one, that employers, they're not responsible for making sure that their employees are safe. They're not responsible for making sure that their employees have a nice, clean environment in which to work. That's not something they're supposed to be worried about. That laborers have to take their own risks, and when it happens. They would not see it as the responsibility of the employer to make sure that people were able to make a good living for themselves. So there's sort of that. But also because of the amount of violence that we're going to see, the amount of how these strikes, particularly in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, how so many of them become so disruptive, several of them becoming quite violent, the public associates labor unions with violence oftentimes, and they associate labor unions with radicalism, with that the workers that are striking, all these people trying to form labor unions, they're just a bunch of radicals that hate capitalism and they just want to watch the world burn. They get associated with these really extreme ideas, which there were plenty of people in the labor movement that did have such extreme ideas, but that's not the majority. But they often get perceived that way. So it's a very long battle for labor unions to kind of convince the rest of the public, people that were not, in the factories, that they have legitimate complaints, and to kind of change the conversation that maybe it was the responsibility of employers to make sure that the workplace was at least safe, or that their health was important and things like that. So all of this is really working against labor unions and workers who have, this Gilded Age. Again, the gilded part means, what do we say? What does gilded mean? Yeah, it's covered in gold, but deep down it's not so much. This is really that part that's not showing. This is that uglier part, because workers shared very disproportionately in the wealth and the success of this period. Now, overall, wages do go up. So if you look at wages, just general workers' wages through the Gilded Age, they do go up significantly, maybe as much as 50 or 60%. But it doesn't go up, in proportion to other people's wealth, and they're still sharing in such a small percentage of it. This new business model that we've talked about, these big corporations, these giant industrial bureaucracies, it's even harder on workers now than it was before, because those bigger organizations are far less personal than they were before. They're more dehumanized. There is less of a employer to employee kind of relationship. There's much greater distance between those two. the mechanization is replacing a lot of workers. It's making them far more expendable, and that makes it very, very difficult for workers to get any kind of change brought about. There are several major strikes in this period. We're going to look at a few of them. And the thing is, what's happening in this period is that strikes are becoming much bigger. And the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 really illustrates that. In the past, strikes tended to be, just as labor unions tended to be, organized, factory by factory. They were quite small. But as, business is getting bigger, so is the unrest. It's spreading from one place to another. The Great Railroad Strike becomes the first strike that takes place over multiple states. This wasn't just in one place. It was not just in one town or even in one state. This eventually spread to multiple states where you had railroad workers striking. It started with one particular railroad company and then spread eventually to 11 different states, railroad workers striking all over those 11 different states. That strike, spreading over so many states, that eventually shut down a huge percentage, not quite half, but maybe close to half of the country's railroads for a time, of workers refusing to work. So hundreds of cities and hundreds of towns, railroad workers were striking, and then violence starts to occur. People start destroying railroad equipment. There start to be, all kinds of fights breaking out and brawls, and hundreds of deaths occur in the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Now, in the end, troops are called in. So this is, again, another example of force being used to stop this. And so eventually the railroad companies appeal to the government, eventually even to the president, saying we need you to send in federal troops to stop the violence and stop the chaos so we can get the railroads running again. And the government does do that. So they send troops in to take over these railroads for a time to stop the violence, and the strike is eventually broken. So the union workers, we have all this violence breaking out. You can see here, these are some images here on the left side. The destroyed railroad, you see the tracks there, and things just look torn up, almost looks kind of bombed out in some places. It does result in the railroad companies did increase wages a little bit after this, but for the most part, it's definitely a victory for the employers that kind of demonstrated that their ability to utilize force and to get the government on their side to stop strikes from taking place. That overall it did fail. But once again, this convinced or demonstrated to a lot of the American public that, or made them feel that the labor movement was violent. And it's, again, something that causes Americans to associate unions and strikes and all that sort of thing with violence. And this was violence and a strike on a scale like no one had ever seen before. So that was very, very alarming to a lot of people. So it overall fails, demonstrates to a lot of Americans that this is a violent problem that needed to be kind of watched and managed. But it also demonstrated to some workers that perhaps there was strength here. Maybe we didn't succeed this time. But they kind of realized, hey, if we can cause a lot, we can get a lot of attention. Not like, oh, let's go cause some more violence and make everybody crazy. But they kind of see the power in banding together into bigger groups. That maybe what they need to do is not think so small, but to think bigger. That we need more organization. We need larger organization. We need to broaden our horizons and try to unite workers over a variety of areas, not just one factory, not even just one industry. But we need to try to pull together for more organization. It demonstrated to some of them the strength in numbers and the power that possibly labor unions could have if they worked together. So that's going to lead to, by the 1860s, 70s, 80s, we're going to start to see some of the first attempts at national labor unions. So again, labor unions have been around for a long time, but up until this point, they had mostly been very, very small, based in a particular factory in a specific place. Just, you're trying to unite the workers in this particular mill or this particular shop or something like that. But we start to see in the late 19th century attempts to unite workers of various trades to create national labor unions and create larger labor unions that would have more success. One of the, it's not the first example, but it is one of the first really notable examples, and that was a group called the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor was an attempt to unite workers of all kinds of trades, both skilled and unskilled. That was one of the things that made the Knights of Labor a bit unusual, in that they included both skilled and unskilled labor. Let's remind ourselves, if someone is a skilled laborer, what does that mean?
Usually that's
They have a special skill that requires special training, like a machinist or something. It is something that not just anybody could do off of the street, because it takes, certain level of education and time to master that craft, versus unskilled labor that does not require, specialized training, and something that more like assembly line kind of work that people could do, relatively quickly off of after getting hired. And there's oftentimes in the labor movement a rift between skilled and unskilled, and they oftentimes don't work together very well. The Knights of Labor was an attempt to overcome that, that as well as including skilled and unskilled workers. The Knights of Labor included African American workers and women, and actually advocated for equal pay for all of those, advocating for equal pay for men and women. Quite unusual in the 19th century. Other than that, equal pay, of course, greater wages were part of better wages were part of the Knights of Labor's platform. An 8-hour workday was part of their platform, a 8-hour workday by law, that workers couldn't be asked to work more than 8 hours a day without, additional compensation of some kind. And the thing about the Knights of Labor and a lot of these labor unions, they actually did not, as an organization, support the idea of strikes. They preferred negotiation. That was kind of their stance, was that they wanted negotiation rather than strikes. However, strikes, of course, do happen. Oftentimes, these organizations, they can't really control what people actually end up doing sometimes. So while they did not publicly, or their official stance was not that strikes were the way to go, they end up happening anyway, as you can probably guess. So they're trying to unite workers of any kind of field, whether they're steel workers, whether they're textile workers, again, men, women, African Americans, which makes the Knights of Labor pretty unique, because they were trying to bridge some of those gaps and make up for some of that divisiveness that we oftentimes see in the labor movement. The Knights of Labor, though, we've already mentioned that labor overall gets associated with violence and with radicalism. And that is ultimately what happens to the Knights of Labor, which leads to their demise, is they get associated with really particularly radical ideas and particularly violent instances. The incident that kind of contributes or really leads to the demise overall of the Knights of Labor was an incident called the Haymarket bombing, or sometimes this is called the Haymarket Incident or the Haymarket Riot. It gets called by a couple of different names. Haymarket Square is in Chicago. There was a labor demonstration, just like a gathering, taking place. It wasn't supposed to be like a big strike. It was not planned as like a violent protest or anything. But somewhere in the crowd, they're all gathering there in the square, the police come in to tell the demonstrators to disperse. And like so many situations like this, eventually shots are fired. Someone throws a bomb, is how it works. So someone in the crowd throws a bomb, and the bomb explodes, kills several people, including several police officers. And when it's all real, there's lots of details that you don't really need to know here about, people being arrested with very, very little evidence and all that kind of stuff. They never really did find exactly who did it, but the people that got associated with it, whether they did it or not, some of them were anarchists. And the thing is that people started to associate the Knights of Labor with anarchists and with violence. And anarchy, of course, being a quite radical political perspective that some laborers did attach themselves to, but certainly not a majority. But because with this bombing, people associated anarchists and violence and that whole thing with the Knights of Labor, even though there's been no evidence ever brought forth to associate the Knights of Labor with this particular incident. But the public really doesn't see much of a difference. And so, again, it contributes to the public seeing the Knights of Labor in particular as advocating violence and advocating anarchy and these very anti-American, anti-capitalistic ideas. And so the Knights of Labor's membership starts to decline and eventually it fizzles out because of that perception of them. The labor union that kind of takes its place, I guess you could say, or that starts to deform in its wake of the Knights of Labor is called the American Federation of Labor, or oftentimes just abbreviated the AFL. The American Federation of Labor is a bit more narrow. The American Federation of Labor was a massive labor union of skilled laborers. So unlike the Knights of Labor that were trying to unite all different kinds of workers, the AFL was specifically skilled labor. So they're a little bit more narrow, a little bit less inclusive, but still a large labor union. And they were not necessarily opposed to strikes, not that they wanted that all the time, and that doesn't mean they want things to be violent, but they weren't necessarily opposed to striking as a means of getting what they wanted, and they supported some of the similar things, higher wages, improving working conditions, all that sort of stuff, and didn't see necessarily striking as the enemy. The leader of the American Federation of Labor in its early years, and he was the president of the American Federation of Labor all the way through into the 20th century, was Samuel Gompers. So he kind of becomes synonymous with the American Federation of Labor and really kind of helps to shape and form the AFL's whole mission and goals, and is a very powerful union leader as far as union leaders go in this particular area. Now, the American Federation of Labor continues on. In fact, it technically still exists. Today it's combined with another group called the Congress of International, I can't remember the last name. It's AFL-CIO is what it's called today. What is the final one? The O?
I think it's
Congress of
Industrial Organization.
That's it. Congress of Industrial Organizations. So today it's the AFL-CIO. So it is still around, actually. However, as we know, none of these labor unions are going to have any kind of lasting success until the 20th century. So all these things that they are wanting, 8-hour workday, all that sort of stuff, we're not going to see them that really be fruitful until the 20th century at least. So we're going to continue to see labor limp along. In a moment, we're going to look at some more strikes that demonstrate those difficulties. But first, I'm going to show you this quick this is more about the Haymarket Incident that will better explain and kind of give you some more details about it, more interesting. It's about 5 minutes, not even 3 minutes. Let's take a look. Sound will be good.
By the 1880s, the United States was going through major political, social, and economic changes. Industry was growing in scale, and innovations in manufacturing were leading to the production of more goods and services. Factories needed workers, and more workers crowded in the cities, causing conflicts between businesses and workers within these industrial centers. One of these cities was Chicago, home to McCormick Harvester Works. For years, the McCormick family had been locked in a battle with the heavily Irish faction of the factory's workers who were in a union and would often strike over wage cuts. Despite efforts to break union activity at the plant, the McCormicks only succeeded in driving many of the factory's disaffected workers to join outside labor unions. On May 1st, 1886, Chicago unions were among those participating in a general strike to limit the workday to 8 hours, in an age where working 10 or more hours a day was commonplace. 2 days later, violence erupted between union and non-union workers at the McCormick factory, after union workers discovered those who crossed the picket line had been given the 8-hour workday. During the skirmish, the police intervened, leaving 2 workers dead and others wounded. On May 4th, a mass meeting was scheduled in Chicago's Haymarket Square, a bustling commercial area, to protest the police brutality and the shootings that occurred outside the McCormick factory. Labor activist August Spies and Samuel Fielding, along with the political journalist Albert Parsons, were among those who gave speeches. At around 10:30 that evening, the police demanded that the meeting disperse. In the moments that followed, an unknown person threw a dynamite bomb into the crowd. Many were injured and a policeman was killed. The police retaliated. Shots were fired. Protesters were struck with clubs. By the time the crowd had dispersed minutes later, 73 policemen had been wounded. 6 of them died from injuries. 4 civilians were killed and at least 12 others were wounded. Although the meeting had been peaceful until the explosion, the public blamed the riot on the organized labor movement and on anarchists and socialists. Because both of these groups were largely made up of immigrants, it added to a fear that foreign ideas threatened American values. After an intensive investigation, 8 men were arrested, including Speeds, Fielding, and Parsons, and tried for inciting the Haymarket riot. After a spectacular trial, where it was revealed that some of the men indicted did not even attend the meeting, and it could not be proven which, if any, of the men had built or set off the bomb, all 8 were found guilty and convicted. 4 were executed. In the wake of the Haymarket riots, the labor movement suffered serious setbacks. Membership rapidly dwindled across the country, and for years, anti-union sentiment swept the nation. This event will serve as an example of the powerful tensions between business and workers in the industrial age.
All right. So again, no real evidence to connect. As you saw there, shoddy evidence to even connect some of the people that got convicted in that whole thing to the actual events, and certainly no specific evidence to connect it to the Knights of Labor, but the public makes that association anyway, and that's a constant. It particularly affects the Knights of Labor after that particular incident, but overall there's just a assumption that all labor unions are radical and violent and all of that. And we should also point out that there is definitely a problem, a weakness of the labor movement itself, that they tend to be divided between skilled workers and unskilled workers. They tend to be anti-immigrant and not wanting to include immigrant workers and all of those things. They oftentimes can be divided racially, men and women, all those sorts of things, and that kind of works against them as well. So that just mentioned that all of that demonstrated the increased tension between workers and the power of the industrialists. We're going to look at 2 more strikes that also demonstrate that demonstrate just how contentious this was getting, how potentially violent it was getting, and also kind of a test of the strength of these new labor unions and attempts at larger unions, and things that are actually going to end up setting the labor movement back. I mentioned just a moment ago that it's not going to be until the 20th century that labor unions will get some significant change, where they will finally get, certainly at the federal level, 8-hour workday, minimum wage, all that kind of stuff doesn't come for quite some time. And perhaps some of the answer to that lies into what happens in some of these strikes. There's 2 we're going to look at here. First is what's called the Homestead Strike in 1892. This had to do with one of Andrew Carnegie's steel plants. We talked about Andrew Carnegie yesterday. This was one of his many steel plants in Homestead, Pennsylvania. And the wages were cut of the workers, and so they go on strike demanding higher wages. Or to actually just have their wages reinstated. They had been lowered, and so they were wanting to have their wages back to where they were so they could continue to make ends meet. The manager of the plant locked out the union workers. So this is an instance when that lockout strategy was used. The workers try to come back in to work and find the place literally chained to where they can't come in to work. And then, of course, a fight breaks out, and basically a battle ensues at the Homestead steel plant between the workers wanting to work, wanting to get their wages reinstated, and the employers. And this strike actually continued for months, and then eventually started to spread to other plants as well. Went on and on. Eventually, the union caves. The union has to give in because it went on again for months with really no end in sight. And eventually, the union had to give in to the employer's demands, and they had to accept the lower wages and those terms. Most of them ended up not being hired back. after they even accepted that. So this was a real setback for unions and for labor, because we had this attempt to unite this, and it does spread, and it became, a huge demonstration. Yet in the end, they had to give in. In the end, it didn't work, and they weren't able to use their power in numbers to affect any sort of change. And it really demonstrated just how powerful those new industrialists were, and the leverage that they had. That the momentum and the leverage was really on their side, not on the side of the workers, and that there wasn't near as much they could do to affect change. So it was very much a setback to them with the failure of the Homestead Strike. And once again, you do have violence and so forth that is further, leading the public perhaps to believe that labor unions they're just a bunch of violent people that want to burn things down. Another example, a little bit later, just a few years later, that also deals another blow to the labor movement was the Pullman Strike. You might have noticed one of the earlier slides had a flyer that said something about Pullman Company. The Pullman Company was a company that made train cars, particularly something called Pullman Palace cars. They were like these luxury train cars. And this was one of those companies that had like a company town. They had little village housing and stuff like that for their employees, which they, of course, charged a rent for. And the wages were cut, but the rent was not decreased, because the way that employers would respond to like economic crises, which I think both of these situations occurred in one, was they would cut the wages of their employees to try to cut the costs. Well, they cut the people's wages, but didn't cut the amount that they got to pay for rent in their housing, and so that's why the workers got upset and started to strike. This eventually shut down several different railroads. Again, it starts to spread through multiple states, and railroads all over the country end up being shut down. Eventually, this spread to 27 different states throughout the Union, which is a lot of them, crippling the railroads, putting a stop to the railroads, and really crippling the economies of a lot of those states, and crippling the economy of the United States as a whole. Because remember, think about how important the railroads were as far as transporting goods and services and all those kind of things. That was becoming really, really crucial. So this put a halt to all of that. Now, the strikers appeal to this person, Eugene V. Debs. He was the leader of a railway union who then kind of starts to lead this strike. He sort of becomes the face and the voice of the striking workers. And Debs says to all railroad workers to not work, not just the Pullman Palace car employees, but appeals to all railroad workers to refuse to work. So that's one of the ways that this strike becomes so large and how it spreads to so many different states. And we'll continue after this to see Eugene V. Debs be a leader in the labor movement. That's why I wanted to mention him here. This is kind of a pivotal moment for him, both showing leadership, and it also is going to affect his overall view of things. But anyway, here is where the interesting thing to me about Pullman Strike is the kind of, it definitely will demonstrate the power of the industrialists and the way that they are able to almost like team up with government to make sure they get what they want at the putting the workers here at a big disadvantage. Here's how they're able to stop this strike. What they do is the executives get strikebreakers to hook up those Pullman Palace cars to mail cars, to train cars that carry the mail. And in doing so, now they can make the argument that the strike is interfering with the mail, which is a federal offense. And that also can get the federal government involved. That makes this a federal issue. The federal government is responsible for making sure that the mail gets delivered. And so by hooking it up to those mail cars, now the federal government can send in forces to get the railroads working again. And that's exactly what ends up happening. So there ends up being a federal injunction, a court order to stop the strike and get the railroads moving again so that the mail can be delivered. And as you can see, it's kind of it's sort of a stretch of an argument, but it definitely works. So that ends the strike. Debs and several other of the strike leaders were arrested. after the whole mail thing, arrested for interfering with the mail, and Debs himself served several months in jail after the Pullman strike. So here we have another failed strike, another incident that really pushes back the labor movement and really gives more power and more ammunition to the industrialists. And this also, because this one ended by way of a court order, that kind of cleared the way for more strikes to be used. It sort of gave the seal of approval that the courts could stop strikes with injunctions. And that could be used in certain situations to keep workers from striking. And that becomes quite a powerful weapon for a lot of employers to keep strikes down. And to break those strikes. So once again, this is a long road for workers. It is a very long and uphill battle, but they, of course, will keep on fighting that fight. This leads Debs to become far more radical. He's going to start embracing more radical and certainly more different theories. He will start embracing socialism, and some of you may know he becomes a leader of a socialist labor union after this, and we'll see him again a little bit. So he's starting to become more radical, but public opinion does start to shift a little bit as a result of these strikes as well. Certainly not all the way, but there is starting to be a little bit more public sympathy, if not just a tiny bit, after these strikes, when some people are starting to say, maybe there needs to be more done. Maybe, obviously if this is causing such violence and such unrest, then maybe there is something to it. And maybe we do need to do something, even if it's not because we just love workers and we think they're mistreated, but we certainly don't want this kind of violence. We don't want this kind of dispute. We need to have more harmonious relationships. So while it's certainly not, I wouldn't say changing public opinion to where the majority of people wanted to do something to help workers, but it's kind of baby steps in that direction with some of these strikes. So we'll continue to see the issues of workers. And again, but we won't see them making any kind of lasting success until the progressive era, and really not to the New Deal. Okay.